In the early 15th century, the Inca city of Cusco was on the rise. Hitherto a fairly inconsequential city state, they had fought and conquered the neighboring Chancas under the leadership of Kusi Yupanqui, who would later take the regnal name of Pachacuti. Plunder from the conquest and tribute from new allies had enriched the Inca and fueled their ambitions. With imperial aspirations, Pachacuti set out to remake Cusco into a city fit to be the center of an empire. Among his projects were the fortress of Sacsayhuaman and the Temple of the Sun, the Coricancha. These were to be grander and more imposing than anything else built in Cusco up to that point. Pachacuti's vision demanded a level of construction, labor, and skill that hadn't been seen in the valley until then. Pedro Cieza de Leon described this building program over a century later when he wrote,
He ordered 20,000 men sent in from the provinces, and that the villages supply them with the necessary food. And if one of them took sick, that another should be sent in his place, and he could return to his home. These Indians were not permanently engaged in this work, but only for a limited time. And then others came and they left. So the work did not become onerous. 4,000 of them quarried and cut the stones. 6,000 hauled them with great cables of leather and cabuya. The others dug the ditch and laid the foundations, while others cut poles and beams for the timbers. Overseers went around, watching what they did, and masters who were highly skilled in their work. Thus, on a hill to the north of the city, at its highest point, slightly more than a bowshot distance, this fortress was built, which the natives called the House of the Sun, and we the fortress. The foundation was dug into solid rock, and the base was constructed so strongly that it will last as long as the world exists.
if you go to Cusco, you can still see the ruins of Sacsayhuaman, the fortress Pachacuti commissioned, though it was continued by his successors Topa Inca and Huayna Capac. Even though he never lived to see it completed, Pachacuti's dream is still going strong. Sacsayhuaman still stands defiantly today, its rugged character and master stonework inspiring awe. Wherever the Inca went, they left an indelible mark with their incredible stone masonry. It has left many a traveler wondering how these stones were cut and fit together so well by a people without the wheel or modern tools. Theories range from the fantastic to the mundane, and today we're going to investigate how the Inca accomplished these amazing works of masonry. Before we get started, I want to give credit where credit is due. The inspiration for this episode was not my own, and I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Tony Trupp of the website Earth as We Know It. Last year, I was contacted by Tony, who was researching this topic, and asked if I'd be interested in making a video on Inca Masonry to put this in front of a wider audience. At the time, I was busy with a lot of projects, and I told him I'd think about it. But then in November, Tony published his article, Masonry Techniques of the Inca's Master Builders, and sent me a copy, and I was blown away by it. This was something I couldn't resist, and Tony has been of great assistance in the research of this topic. He has been very generous in checking my research and permitting me to use his wonderful photos. If you'd like to check out his article, it will be in the description below. Everyone, please thank him in the comments. With that out of the way, let's get back to the introduction. Like always, we have to talk about sources to appreciate the information at our disposal. Contrary to the idea that Inca Masonry is a huge mystery that we know nothing about, we actually have a lot of information on this, though there are a few parts that remain poorly understood. First and foremost, we have many Inca ruins that archaeologists have investigated, such as Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, Machu Picchu, Chinchero, Rumicolca, and many others. What's really nice about several of these sites is that they were still under construction when the empire fell. Because of the Inca Civil War and the subsequent and rapid conquest by the Spanish, work abruptly stopped at a lot of these sites, so we can see these construction sites frozen in time. These provide us with a wealth of information about Inca construction and stoneworking. As we'll see later on, we don't just have access to ruins, we also have access to Inca quarries from which the Inca extracted their stones and transported them. Second, we have Spanish and native accounts that discuss Inca methods of construction. In fact, the amount of Spanish accounts that discuss Inca masonry really surprised me. As it turns out, colonial writers actually wrote quite a bit about it. This makes sense because, like us today, the Spanish were fascinated by the Incas' intricate and fine stonework and also wanted to know how this was done, and their accounts provide us with very valuable insight. Lastly, we have modern scholars who have studied Inca masonry. Several scholars have devoted considerable investigation into this topic, and some have even done experiments to recreate Inca masonry. This is important because I firmly believe that the best research on this is based on a good understanding of the technology that we can confirm the Inca possessed, rather than appealing to the unknown, fantastic, or mysterious technology that we can't prove the Inca even had. The researchers that have taken this approach have yielded some really incredible discoveries and insights, and we are very indebted to their work. Now, in my research, one of these scholars really stood out, and that was John Pierre Protzin, or JP, as I'm going to affectionately be calling him in this episode. If you read any literature mentioning Inca masonry and construction and JP isn't the author, you will see his name in the citations, and that's not a coincidence. He spent years rigorously studying numerous Inca sites and quarries, taking careful measurements and observations to understand their techniques, and as we'll see later, even experimented with different methods to recreate Inca masonry. His work has been incredibly important to this topic. I think it's safe to say that until he passed away in 2021, he was one of the most knowledgeable people on Inca masonry on the planet, perhaps even the most knowledgeable. So his research is going to cast a big shadow over this episode. Other researchers, such as Stella Nair, John Rao, and Vince Lee, have also contributed to our understanding through their studies of Inca architecture. One word of warning, I don't speak Quechua, so if there are any mispronunciations ahead, I do apologize. Before we dive into the Inca themselves, I want to actually begin with an overview on stoneworking in the Andes more broadly so that we can appreciate its wider development. This will help us put Inca masonry into a better context. The Inca were not the first Andean people to work with stone. Far from it. There was actually a robust Andean tradition of stoneworking that spanned thousands of years, and I think we'll appreciate Inca stonework a lot more with a good understanding of this. The earliest monumental Andean stoneworking and masonry comes from the north coast of Peru. The coastal river valleys host some of the earliest surviving monumental architecture and stone masonry in South America. Around the Casma and Supe valleys, we can find some of the oldest urban centers in the Americas, and we can see that from as far back as 4,600 years ago in 2600 BCE, people were already constructing large buildings and monuments out of stone. Looking at the city of Caral, we can see that they built stone pyramids and sunken courts and erected monoliths. At the site of Cerro Sachin in the Casma Valley, which dates to about 1,000 years later, we see some impressive stone construction that utilized granite that they quarried and carved with images of warriors, priests, and what are likely sacrificial victims, but there's some debate around that. As you can see in this picture, some of these stones are quite large, though I was not able to get any weight estimates on them. In the highlands, people were also building impressive stone structures. If we go to the incredible site of Chavin de Huantar, whose construction dates from about 1200 BCE to 500 BCE, we can see a large temple complex with sunken courts that was built in phases over several centuries as the site expanded. The temple is made entirely of stone blocks and decorated with different religious elements added to the facade. On the sides of the buildings and plazas are intricately carved tenon heads and stone friezes that show a maturing of skill. Of note are the 2.5-meter tall Teo obelisk and the 4.5-meter tall Lenzon stela, both carved from solid granite, which show that these people were eager to take up the challenge of quarrying and carving large stones. Inside the temple is a labyrinth of corridors that are still standing over 2,000 years later, despite Lord knows how many earthquakes in the region. To recap here, even before 1 CE, there was a well established tradition of people working with stone to construct large master planned buildings that required the labor of hundreds, perhaps thousands of people over long time periods. But we're just getting started because during the next several centuries, we begin to see the emergence of empires, and this allows us to see masonry on an entirely new scale. The next 1,000 years was dominated by two states, Tiwanaku and Wari. I've covered both of these in previous episodes, so if you want to brew up a nice cup of tea, get cozy, and learn about the first Andean empires for 2 hours, be my guest. In both of these states, the elites were able to draw upon previously unimagined resources of material and labor. So, what did they do? Let's start with the Wari. The Wari Empire began in the Ayacucho Basin around 600 CE and quickly began conquering and absorbing their neighbors. These were a people with serious ambition who built outposts and facilities all over their empire, such as Piquillacta, Cerro Baul, Wilcahuane, and Pachacamac. These are all master planned, built on a grid, and feature elaborate complexes, canals, and aqueducts. The construction of these sites is characterized by field stones mortared together, which then would have been plastered over. This isn't very different from what we've seen earlier, but if we go to the Wari capital, at the aptly named site of Wari, we see that the masonry goes up a notch in sophistication. Now, to be clear, most of the masonry at the Capitol is fieldstone and mortar, like we mentioned earlier. But at the Capitol, we find many examples of finely and precisely cut stone and ashlar masonry. Tombs are constructed with finely cut stones that are precisely fitted together. Some examples of drilled out stones even exist. The Wari show us a few important things. First, they show what is possible with imperial patronage. The Wari had access to the finest masons and architects, and had the resources to employ their skills in new ways. Second, they show us that even successful empires have different means of construction that depended on the resources available at any given time. Even though the Wari were capable of finely cut stone construction, they didn't build everything out of it. Only the most important construction, particularly royal tombs, got this kind of attention and investment, and this is a pattern we'll see in the Inca Empire as well. Speaking of the Inca, it's also worth noting that they likely drew a lot of inspiration from the Wari, even though they were separated by almost 3 centuries. Long before they ever rose to prominence, they would have seen Wari ruins around them and likely shared stories about the glory of the old empire. Perhaps the finest pre Inca stonework, however, comes from the next empire in the Lake Titicaca region to the south, Tiwanaku. Now, this area has its own stoneworking tradition that goes back to the Pucara culture, which lasted from 900 to 100 BCE. Over the course of their history, they refined the craft, producing incredible relief sculptures. Tiwanaku continued this tradition and refined it even further. Tiwanakan masonry is dominated by finely cut squared ashlars. These can range in size from large blocks to smaller blocks filling in gaps. Many of these large blocks have 90-degree corners that often sit next to each other in uniform height. If that isn't impressive enough, many blocks and stones at Tiwanaku also have finely carved decorations and reliefs, showing that these masons had the tools and skills to delicately carve stone. The stones of Pumapunku can testify to their incredible ability. We know from looking at unfinished stones at the site that they were shaped by hammer stones or chisels before being finished and smoothed with other tools. Stella Nair has been able to replicate those carved corners using an obsidian shard chisel. Also, metal drills that were used to drill holes have been recovered. Tiwanakan masonry also has hints of standardized shapes and sizes, and some have suggested that some of these blocks may have been prefabricated before being moved to the site and put into place. Looking at all of these, we can see a very sophisticated level of stoneworking that could consistently produce right angles, smooth stone, and cut interior corners. Although Tiwanaku was further away from the Inca heartland, it's reasonable to speculate that the Inca drew inspiration from Tiwanakan stonework. What's important to take away from this retrospective is that we can see a pattern of evolving and maturing techniques in the Andes as time goes on. As cities turn into states and as states turn into empires, stoneworking becomes increasingly sophisticated in quality and execution, and this makes sense. Larger and more powerful states were able to amass larger workforces and train and retain experienced craftsmen and specialists. By the time the Inca arrived on the scene, there were centuries of high level stone masonry that they could draw upon. There's actually some interesting carbon dating evidence that suggests that a few polygonal walls in Cusco actually date to the prior Quilque culture, though some critics have argued that the carbon dates are due to older reused materials. If true, though, the ancestors of the Inca may have already had some practice with this, but later expansion clearly supercharged their efforts. The Inca even had a special system of labor tax called mita that allowed them to muster corvée labor on an incredible scale. The success of this is attested by the numerous imperial projects throughout the empire, like buildings, roads, bridges, and terraces. Therefore, we should expect to see some really amazing masonry that draws from both rich traditions and local ingenuity that was backed by the patronage of the largest empire in the Americas. Fine masonry shouldn't be unexpected, and indeed, we can look back on that tradition and see elements that the Inca embraced, such as finely cut and fitted masonry, elements that they mostly rejected, such as tenoned architectural pieces, and elements that they adapted and innovated, such as fine polygonal masonry. As skillful as the Inca were with stone, they did not regard it simply as a crude material. The Inca had a very unique relationship with stone. Most of us probably think of stone as something cold, inorganic, and inert. To the ancient Inca, this notion could not be further from the truth. The Inca inhabited a world of living stone. Stone was something that could be alive, animate, and even sacred. In some Andean creation myths, this was the very material of human creation. According to Juan de Betanzos' narrative of the Incas, Viracocha himself had created the first humans from stone. The mountains of the Andes had apus, spirits that protected local people. Important mountains, stones, and landmarks could be considered wakas, which were sacred spaces or features. Many wakas were boulders or mountains, or even stones from a certain mountain that had been relocated. However, other stones could even embody specific people. A good example were wauki, which in Quechua means male brother. Wauki were large, unworked, and unsculpted rocks that embodied the masculine traits of certain men or gods. All Inca rulers had a wauki that was treated as the ruler, even after the ruler died. The Inca saw wauki as the men themselves. These were not sculpted or shaped in any way, but were still seen as the embodiment of the person. Another example are huanca, which were rocks that were understood to be petrified owners of places such as fields, valleys, and villages. These landmarks embodied founding ancestors and gave certain families and peoples a claim to specific land. One of the most famous huancas, noted by historian Maria Rostorowski, was the petrified Ayur Auca, the brother of the first Inca, who turned to stone when his family migrated to the Cusco Valley, and it later stood as a symbol of the Inca's claim to territorial possession. But stones could also be personified in other ways as well. Many Inca stories discuss sakusca, or what are often called tired stones. Tired stones are stones that were never finished being moved from the quarry to their destination, and many examples can be seen today across the former empire. In these stories, the tired stones are personified as beings who are too anguished to be relocated by Inca workers and are often described as weeping as they are being moved. In all the stories, the sympathetic Inca come to understand this and leave the tired stones where they remain today. Now, stones weren't always inanimate, they could come alive. The most famous example are the Puruauca around Cusco. According to Inca legends, these stones had transformed into elite warriors to help the Inca forces under Pachacuti defend Cusco against the forces of the rival Chanca before turning back into stone. The point I'm making is that the Inca appreciated stone and its essence on an entirely different level than we do. They saw it as something that could be alive, sacred, and powerful. It's not a coincidence that we often see fine masonry married to natural rock formations at many Inca sites. They appreciated stone in a way that many of us, quite frankly, do not. With all that out of the way, let's dive in and examine Inca masonry to see how the Inca crafted the stones that they were so fond of. To be clear, we are only talking about stone masonry and not adobe masonry. I realize that adobe bricks were a frequently used building material by the Inca, and there is incredible adobe architecture out there to explore, but that's going to remain out of the scope of today's video. This video is so long, we aren't even halfway through. Anyways, there are two types of Inca stone masonry: mortared masonry and bonded masonry. Mortared masonry is the most simple type of masonry that the Inca employed. In this method, the Inca used undressed field stones, mortared together and often plastered over. Examples of these buildings can be seen at many Inca sites. If you were a commoner living in a stone house, odds were that this was the construction used. This was a very simple, cheap, and effective construction method that would have been available to many. In contrast to mortared masonry, there's bonded masonry, which joins the stones without using any mortar. The Inca referred to such construction as kaninakupirka, meaning a well worked wall, in contrast to an ordinary stone wall, which was called pirkani. The very word kaninakupirka is actually more descriptive than it looks because the word kanin is related to kani, the act of nibbling or biting. Keep that in mind because it's going to come up later. Bonded masonry was reserved for important buildings and projects. Besides just being of finer quality, bonded masonry had the benefit of being much more aseismic or earthquake resistant than mortared masonry. That's not to say that it's impervious to earthquake damage. You can find examples of earthquake damage in Inca structures that used bonded masonry. Bonded masonry comes in two types: polygonal and ashlar. Polygonal masonry is probably what the Inca are most famous for, and I'm guessing that it's probably the reason why many of you clicked on this video. It refers to masonry that uses stones with more than 5 faces, as opposed to 4-sided rectangular blocks that can be stacked in a predictable fashion. In polygonal masonry, stones of various sizes and shapes have to be fitted together. Technically, this can be done with or without mortar, though the Inca did not use mortar in their polygonal masonry. You might think that polygonal masonry is unique to the Inca, but it actually isn't. Many cultures all over the world at different times have employed this with a lot of skill. Here's an example from Italy, and another from Japan, but there are many more out there. By contrast, ashlar masonry is when stones are cut and dressed to a specific form and pattern, usually a rectangular form. Although the Inca are famous for their polygonal masonry, to the point where we often think of it as peak Inca, the Inca appear to have held ashlar masonry in the highest regard, based on the fact that they tended to use it in their most sacred and elite buildings. You can see a beautiful example here at the Coricancha at Cusco. Again, ashlar masonry is not unique to the Inca. Many cultures all over the world have employed this, and it's even still used today. These different types of masonry are important to keep in mind because the Inca were not one trick ponies and approached stone construction in different ways. In fact, if you go to Inca sites, you're likely to see multiple types of masonry employed. A good example is the site of Pisac, where you can find buildings constructed with loosely fitted mortared masonry near buildings made of finely bonded masonry. At Tarawasi, you can see polygonal and ashlar masonry side by side. Different types of masonry helped reinforce a hierarchy in construction. The most important and sacred buildings could easily be identified by the type of construction. Residences or utilitarian buildings might be mortared, while the elite residences, sacred spaces, and temples would be made of bonded masonry. Thus, mortared masonry could act as a foil or contrast for bonded masonry, just as polygonal masonry could act as a contrast to ashlar. Going forward, we're going to focus on that bonded masonry and examine the process that took stone from the quarry, transported it to the worksite, shaped it to specifications, and then finally fitted it into the Kaninakupirka. Now let's close our eyes and imagine that we are workers or foremen or college interns that are going to witness every step of this process. With that, let's begin. Before any stone could be worked, the Inca would have to source the material. The Inca worked with many different types of stone, and selecting the right type of stone was something that merited a lot of consideration. For example, the black andesite that was used in many palaces and temples in Cusco was sourced from one quarry at Huacoto, about 15 kilometers or 9 miles away, and also from a quarry at Rumicolca, about 21 kilometers or 13 miles away. The Inca had other stone quarries that were closer to them, but they specifically chose this black andesite for those buildings. By contrast, most of the stones at Sacsayhuaman were sourced from local stone nearby, though that was probably of little consolation to the people who had to quarry and move it. But hey, it could be worse. Now, it's important to remember that the Inca saw many stones as animate and sacred. These quarries were not just sources of material, but were often considered sacred wakas in their own right. According to Spanish writer Father Bernabe Cobo, they were given offerings. In fact, in some areas of the southern Andes, this practice continues to this day. Once a quarry was selected, the Inca would have to prepare it. To do this, the site would have had ramps and roads prepared so that the quarried stones could be moved out. Modern investigations have shown that these ramps tend to have a gentle slope of 8 to 12 degrees and are usually 4 to 8 meters wide. We'll discuss the transportation of stones shortly. For now, let's discuss how the rocks were quarried and extracted. Based on archaeological investigations of Inca quarries, the most common approach was for Inca quarrymen to exploit natural fractures in the landscape. At the site of Rumicolca, undisturbed sections of the quarry show that stone was pried out of natural fractures, most likely with bronze bars such as these, but they could also be hammered out as well. Modern experiments by our man JP have shown that rocks could be split easily along natural fracture lines, and that this may have sufficed for the quarrymen. However, at other sites, most stones were never hewn from bedrock or split from outcrops at all. Instead, Inca foremen would have selected rocks from among rockfalls that met their specifications. There's also evidence that another method was employed. I'm willing to bet that some of you may be familiar with using wedges to split rocks. In this method, wedges are driven into a rock until it splits in two. This method was used by many ancient cultures around the world and is even still used today. But did the Inca employ this method? There's pretty good evidence that they did. Some Inca sites have blocks that were in the process of being split before work stopped. You can see examples here from Machu Picchu and Tipon. You can clearly see the wedge holes along these splits. That said, no actual wedges have been recovered, so the evidence may be a bit circumstantial. And in fact, some have argued that the Machu Picchu picture I showed you is a modern split from recent times, though I'm personally very skeptical of that claim. At any rate, this method wasn't universally used. At Ollantaytambo, for example, only one block shows any evidence of being split using a channel and wedges. Almost all visible work shows that these were detached by exploiting natural fractures, even in cases where it would have been appropriate to use wedges. Regardless of which approach was used at any given time and site, the Inca were clearly skilled at detaching rock from quarries and outcrops. So once the rock was free from the earth or selected from rubble, how was it initially worked? We actually have a very good understanding of this from archaeology, Spanish chronicles, and modern experiments. The Spanish writers who were interested in Inca masonry reported that the Inca used hammer stones to shape the stones into blocks. For example, Inca Garcilaso de la Vega recorded in his Comentarios Reales de los Incas,
They had no other tools to work stone than some black stones they called ihuaya, with which they dressed stone by pounding rather than cutting.
archaeologists have found many hammerstones left behind in quarries. These are easy to identify because of their rounded shape, and the fact that they're almost always made of foreign material. These are often made of hard rocks like quartzite, basalt, rhyolite, and iron-rich hematite. Masons would have used these hammerstones to roughly hew stones so that they could be transported. Experiments have shown that using these hammerstones produces identical tool marks that are found on unused blocks, as well as identical detritus and flakes that are found in Inca quarries. Now, we might look at this technique of using stones to bash other stones into shape as extremely demanding and backbreaking, but this is actually a bit easier than it looks. JP conducted an experiment to see how feasible these methods were. Using a raw andesite block, roughly 25 by 25 by 30 centimeters, he took a hammerstone and removed large protrusions and cut a face on the block. He found that by striking the block at a 15 to 25 degree angle, that progress accelerated considerably by flaking off the surface. Cutting 5 edges and dressing 3 sides took less than 90 minutes. JP speculates that an experienced worker could probably do this in even less time than him. Applying this and other experiments to his investigations at Ollantaytambo, JP drew this conclusion.
At this rate, a quarryman can pound out a trough 15 centimeters wide and 180 centimeters long in 21 hours, or say 3 working days. Given that one worker requires a space of about 75 centimeters, or the width of 5 troughs, that worker could rough out a section of 75 and 180 centimeters in 15 days. 15 days is thus the time it would take 21 quarrymen working side by side to rough out the 4 vertical sides of a block. 4.5 meters long, 3.2 meters wide, and 1.7 meters high. Because of the nature of the fracture planes, most blocks in the quarry would have two relatively clean faces needing little or no work. Thus, with an adequate workforce, 2 or at the most 3 weeks is all that it would have taken to prepare even the largest block in the quarries of Cachicara. Keeping within these time frames, 15 crews of 20 workers could have roughed out the total of 150 blocks of rose rhyolite found in the quarries, on the road, scattered around the construction site, and in situ in the walls in less than 8 months.
That's very feasible quarry time in an empire where Mita labor was plentiful and available. Now, it's worth noting that the blocks were usually not finished at the quarry. They were shaped only as much as was needed to ease transportation before they were shipped out. The nearby quarry of Cachicata contains holding areas for blocks ready to be transported to Ollantaytambo. With that said, we have our rough-hewn block, and now it needs to be moved from the quarry to the construction site. Stone blocks could vary wildly in size. The largest stones at Sacsayhuaman in Cusco are estimated to weigh between 100 and 200 tons, though it's worth pointing out that those sizes are the exception and not the rule. Most blocks in Inca construction were much smaller, weighing between 50 and 150 kilograms, or 100 and 300 pounds. But looking back at those larger blocks, how would those be moved without modern machinery or draft animals? Again, we can look at Spanish accounts for some answers. Juan de Betanzos again gives us some very useful details, and we quote,
They found that there was an abundance of stone and large quarries in the vicinity of Salou. Immediately after arriving there, they gave the order about how they were to bring and transport the building stones. For this purpose, they had a large number of ropes, thick cables of sinew and llama hide.
lest you think that this is an isolated written account, we have others. This one comes from the former magistrate of Cusco, Juan Polo de Ondegardo's narrative of the rights and laws of the Incas.
To this lever was added the conveyance of stones from great distances by force of man's arms. Anyone who has seen their edifices will not doubt their statements that 30,000 men were employed.
These and several other sources agree that these were moved by many hands pulling many ropes. Heck, you can even see many examples of large stones that were in the process of being moved before work stopped. Those are the tired stones that we mentioned earlier. If you have enough people, you can move big stuff. Some of you may be wondering how strong these ropes were. Luckily for us, some Andean communities still make ropes out of traditional materials, and these are deceptively strong and reliable. A study by John Oxendorf looked at the strength of traditional cords made from ichu grass by a Quechua community and found that a 2-inch cord could support 1,800 kilograms or 4,000 pounds. The study showed that these grass cords are 20% stiffer than cotton cords and 60% as stiff as modern nylon. Many of you in the audience may be thinking of rope bridges that the Inca made that could carry people, llamas, and whole caravans. These people knew how to make a strong rope. Braid enough of those bad boys together, and you have a rope with some serious tensile strength. Now, I'm sure a few of you viewers might be saying, Ancient Americas, you're telling me that a bunch of yokels with ropes could lift 100 metric ton plus block and move it? And no, I never said lift. I said move, and that's key. These blocks were not lifted, but dragged. And that's important because to drag something, you only need to overcome the friction between the stone and the surface it's being dragged on. You don't need to pull the entire weight. Remember when I mentioned that the Inca employed ramps at their quarries? Well, we also find ramps at many sites that were never completed. At the site of Ollantaytambo, the ramps are still visible along the side of the mountain. If that's a little too ethereal for your taste, check out the site of Cutimbo or Silustani, which still have their construction ramps standing. Now, ramps aren't the entire picture here. We know from archaeology that the Inca carefully prepared roads using multiple layers of clay and gravel. They made sure that the surface was prepared properly to ease movement. Skeptics might object that pulling really large stones would be too demanding over a flat surface, much less a ramp. But is that truly the case? To analyze this, we can do some physics and crunch some numbers. I realize that this isn't a physics channel, and I was not a successful physics student, which is why I'm teaching you this instead of bankrolling a life of luxury designing skyscrapers. Stay in school, kids. However, I come from a family of engineers and STEM majors who are much smarter than me and therefore baffled by my career choices. Thankfully for us, one of them is a physics teacher, and he was very easy to bribe into doing the hard work. Everyone, go thank my cousin Dave in the comments for being a good sport. Hope you're ready for some physics, dear viewers. Let's put on our math hats. The force required to move something up a slope can be expressed as the coefficient of friction times the normal force of the object. In our case, the normal force of the object can be calculated as the object's weight times the cosine of the slope plus the sine of the slope times the object weight to account for the weight component down the hill. So that gives us this formula. Boy, if only my high school teachers could see me now. Let's put this to work by looking at the case of one of the large blocks at Sacsayhuaman. What would it take to move a colossal 100 metric ton block? And just to make things interesting, let's say that we have to drag it up an 8-degree slope at certain points. The coefficient of friction I'm using comes from calculations and experiments done by our man JP on a simple compacted surface, in case any physics nerds in the audience are curious. That gives us this formula, which gives us a minimum pulling force of roughly 88 metric tons or 97 tons up a ramp. By contrast, it would be 75 metric tons or 82.7 tons on a flat surface. If we consider that an average person can pull about 50 kilograms or 110 pounds of force, it means that you would need almost exactly 1,765 people to move that sucker up a slope, and approximately 1,500 people to move it across a flat surface. Now, that is a lot of people moving a rock, but we need to remember that the Inca Empire had access to enormous labor forces. Remember that quote at the beginning from Cieza de Leon? He mentions a work crew of 10,000 laborers working on Sacsayhuaman. Polo de Ondegardo's quote from earlier mentioned work crews of 30,000. Sure, those numbers could be exaggerated, but we should note that the Incas kept excellent and detailed records with quipus, and it's entirely possible that those numbers were based on Inca records. Also, if you're an all powerful Sapa Inca and the descendant of the sun, labor requirements are simply a quota to be filled. Your lunatic whims are your subjects' marching orders. JP also notes that this workforce could have been split between the front and back of the stone, with some people leveraging the back with pry bars made out of bronze or wood. Judging from the fact that bronze crowbars have been found in excavations, I think that this is very reasonable to speculate. Now, this is a very rare and very extreme case. Only a select few blocks would have ever approached those numbers. By comparison, a 10 metric ton block or 11-ton block would only require about 175 people up a slope, and that's still a decently big block by Inca standards. As I mentioned earlier, most blocks were between 50 and 150 kilograms or 100 and 300 pounds. Something like that could be moved by less than 10 people easily. Interestingly, in 1996, a crew of 250 people in Ollantaytambo were able to move a 15-ton block over a cobbled street with just ropes and pry bars, the same tools that the Inca had. This was actually captured on film as part of a Nova documentary, Secrets of Lost Empires, the Inca. So, if you can find a copy of the episode, you can see it for yourself. However, we can get those numbers lower. If we go back to our original example, moving that same 100 metric ton block on a surface of ballast or gravel instead, it would reduce the coefficient of friction to 0.7 and require only about 1,665 people on an 8-degree slope and 1,400 on a flat surface. Still a lot, but ladies and gentlemen, can we do even better? Theoretically, we can. Unfortunately, I don't have friction coefficients, so I can't give you hard numbers, but if the Inca used better surfaces, rollers, skids, or lubricants to grease the track, this could lower the friction further and decrease the force needed to move those blocks. Remember, the Inca carefully prepared the roads and paths that the stones were going to be transported on. In effect, this would have lowered the friction and the force requirement for pulling. There's some dispute about whether or not rollers were used. Spherical stones that were allegedly used for rolling are displayed in some museums, but I'm not sure about the context that these were recovered in, so I can't confirm this with any certainty. Reportedly, there's a megalith at Machu Picchu that has a roller stone underneath it, but again, I couldn't find any confirmation. Archaeologist John Rao also provides an intriguing anecdote in his famous work, Inca Culture at the Time of the Conquest of the Spanish, where he says that he heard of a treasure hunter who dug under a large Inca block at a quarry near Ollantaytambo and allegedly found remains of wooden rollers under it. I'm a bit skeptical of this without any solid documentation, but such measures are worth mentioning because people who need to move big rocks have every incentive to find work saving measures, and there are such measures readily available. We also know that these were used by other cultures around the world, so it seems to be a fairly straightforward solution. Quick aside before we leave transportation entirely. For those that are still skeptical of the Incas' ability to move material over distance, there's very good evidence that the Inca moved stone blocks over absolutely insane distances. Friend of the channel, Glenn Short from the channel Gringo Loco, tipped me off to a site in Ecuador called Saraguro, near the former Inca site of Villamarca. The modern town has several Inca blocks that have been incorporated into the town architecture. One might assume that these blocks were quarried locally by the Inca before they were repurposed by the local people. Many Inca sites in Ecuador utilize local stone, but that actually isn't the case at Saraguro. Analysis of these Inca stones by Dennis Ogburn have shown that they originate from quarries at Rumicolca, the same place that the Inca quarried their stones for the Coricancha. That means that those stones had to travel a mind boggling 1,400 kilometers or 860 miles away as the crow flies. The actual distance would be longer as it wound its way through the rugged Andes. To put that in perspective, that's the distance from New York City to St. Louis, but it's all mountains. These stones range in size from 200 kilograms or 440 pounds to 700 kilograms or 1,500 pounds. They could not have been moved by llamas. They had to be moved by people. We also have textual accounts which record that the Inca moved these and not later people. Guaman Poma, Cieza de Leon, and Miguel Cabello Balboa recorded these endeavors, but a more detailed account comes from Fray Martin de Merua. To quote,
They say that the great Huayna Capac ordered 2 houses of very fine stonework to be made in this great city of Cusco. And once they were made, he had them disassembled stone by stone, and he ordered that they be rebuilt in Quito. And toward this objective, they carried all of those stones. And after arriving with them near Quito, in the land of the Cañares, in a settlement called Saraguru, a lightning bolt struck and broke the principal stone of the building, the stone that was to lay over the primary doorway. And once they informed the Inca of this, he feared it and took it for a bad omen, and ordered that they leave there all these stones where they lie today in the said location, next to the Royal Road.
moving stones of that size over such a huge distance is nothing short of staggering. Without Ogburn's work, I would declare that this is clearly exaggerated or misinformed, but the evidence here is really compelling. Again, this testifies to the incredible ability of the Inca state to muster labor and resources for building projects, all to build Huayna Capac his ultimate summer getaway, complete with water slide. If you're curious why this was done rather than using local andesite, Ogbird suggests that Huayna Capac may have been tapping into the power of those stones or the waka that they came from to make a powerfully symbolic statement of transferring sacred power from Cuzco to his new capital in Ecuador. Based on what we discussed earlier regarding the Inca's relationship with stone, I'm very inclined to agree with this interpretation. Super crazy, but let's get back on track now. Okay, moving that block was tough work, but now we've arrived with our block at the work site and have come to what is probably the least understood and most tantalizing aspect of Inca bonded masonry, the fitting of the blocks together. As someone who has personally seen this masonry, I and anyone else can tell you that these blocks fit tightly together and there ain't a wiggle on them, and it's incredible to see. Not only are these blocks fit to the blocks below them, but they're also fit to the blocks all around them. As I mentioned earlier, blocks were not finished at quarries. They would have been finished and dressed at the site in order to get that tight fit we love so very much. But how was this done? Again, let's look at some colonial accounts. Juan Polo de Ondegardo's account that we quoted earlier states,
This work was very toilsome, for all their buildings were of masonry, and they had no tools of iron or steel either to hew the stones out of the quarries or to shape them afterwards. All this was done with other stones, which was a labor of extreme difficulty. They did not use lime and sand, but adjusted one stone to another with such precision that the point of junction is scarcely visible.
but we can also look at Inca sites with unfinished work and see that many stones have troughs or pans carved into them. This suggests that masons would hammer out wide, shallow troughs into the face of the rock to refine the shape before smoothing the surface. Hammerstones have also been found at these sites in many sizes, and judging from the large pit scars in the middle of the rocks and the finer scars along the edges and joints, we can conclude that larger hammerstones were used on the faces, and smaller hammers, or possibly chisels, were used on edges to prepare for the final fitting. Remember earlier when I mentioned that kanin in kaninakupirka meant nibbled? This is the nibbling we're talking about. In the case of sharp edges or recesses, smaller elongated hammer stones and rock shards that could have acted as chisels were likely used, and at least one example has been found at an Inca quarry site. Bronze chisels likely could have fulfilled this role as well, but these are a rare find at Inca sites. I imagine a lot of that bronze was melted down long ago. If polishing was called for, abrasives like sand or soil could be ground against the rock surface with another rock. This would eliminate most of the pit scars on the rock face. JP's experiments have shown that a glossy polish on a stone can be achieved in about 15 minutes with this technique. Drafting cuts have been found on walls and on loose building blocks, which show that, like other stonemasons, the Inca drafted edges before they cut the face of the rock. Alright, that tells us how the stone was cut and shaped, but how do you get a fit like this? Not only does the stone need to be bonded to the stones below, but also to the adjacent stones. Jesuit missionary Jose de Acosta gives us a tiny but important clue about how this was done in his 1590 work, Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias.
And what one most admires is that although these stones on the wall I'm talking about are not cut straight but are very uneven in size and shape among themselves, they fit together with incredible precision without mortar. All this was done with much manpower and much endurance in the work. For in order to fit one stone to another so precisely, it was necessary to try the fit many times, the stones not being even or full.
Note what he wrote in the last sentence. It was necessary to try the fit many times. This is also echoed by other writers as well, who note that these bonds were achieved through a process of trial and error to get the fit just right. All of this might seem very demanding to us, but again, we got JP to the rescue, because he attempted to replicate this process by fitting two andesite blocks together, using nothing but hammerstones, two hands, and a keen eye. He observed from walls that had been dismantled that cuts were made into the block below to create a bedding joint to receive the next course of blocks above. Taking this cue, he started carving a bedding joint onto one of the blocks to fit the other. Once this was done, he outlined the joint and then pounded out the other block to get it to fit. In one of his articles, he notes that the dust that gets kicked up is very useful to check the fit. Wherever surfaces touch, the dust is compressed, and this is an important visual indicator of which areas need to be smoothed and shaped further. By repeating this process, he achieved a tight bond that you can see here. Here's a comparison to original Inca stonework. Not bad at all for amateur effort. I'll say this again, but I imagine an experienced mason could get very good at this. The same trial and error process could also be used to get a lateral fit as well. With patience and a keen eye, you can get real good fittings. Now, these fits can actually be a bit deceptive. A good craftsman knows exactly where they can take shortcuts and cut corners and get away without anyone else noticing, and Inca Masons were no exception. We like to imagine these blocks being fit and locked perfectly together like Tetris blocks. If you go to the Coricancha in Cusco, you can see some really amazing examples of such fittings. However, that's not always the case. In many cases, only the face of the canina cuperca was finely fitted, while the interior wasn't. This is most common with lateral joints. Many fine lateral fits that you see only go about a few centimeters deep, while the rest of the interior gap is filled with earth or rubble. You can see examples of walls at Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo where it's very clear that only the wall face is finely fitted and that the interior has other fill. Spanish accounts also note that the Incas sometimes used a red clay called llanca to improve fits between stones. In these cases, the mason could reduce the fitting work to a narrow band on the face. This technique was actually extremely useful in instances where two work crews started at either end of a wall and met in the middle. In this case, there would have been a gap that may not have been able to be filled by setting a block down in the manner that we discussed. So, how do you fit a stone into that gap? You use a wedge stone. These stones appear to have been made to fill gaps once work from two sides reached a point where only room for one stone remained. Inca masons typically filled these gaps with a wedge shaped stone, like this. In this case, the stone was not lowered into position and fit via trial and error like what we've described thus far. Rather, they were shaped like a wedge and had the face shaped to fit the hole before it was inserted into the wall. Since these could not be precisely fit like other stones, Inca masons compensated for this by leaving a lip around the edges of the stone to conceal any imperfections in the fitting. Because of the looser fitting, these wedge stones also tend to fall out of walls, and several have been found lying loose on the ground, but they can also be seen fit into many surviving walls. Identifying these stones is actually really handy because it can help identify the sequence in which stones were laid during construction. Based on the presence of wedge stones, JP suggests that most walls were started at the corners and then progressed towards the center. One quick aside here, I know we've been talking mainly about the fitting of polygonal masonry, but it's worth noting that many of the same techniques could be applied to ashlars. Some of you may think that ashlar was easier, but it probably would have taken more time to shape and fit since they required fine edges and right angles. It's also worth mentioning that as complicated as polygonal masonry looks, it's actually easier than ashlar masonry in some respects, because it embraced unplanned variation rather than adhering to a rigid right angled rectangular form. Art and architecture historian Stella Nair quotes a personal communication from JP on this phenomenon that really drives this point home.
Pratzen has noted that while polygonal masonry is impressive, its manufacture is actually far more forgiving than that of ashlar masonry. One of the most common mistakes that novice stonemasons make is overhitting a corner and thus unintentionally breaking off a slice of the stone. If this happens in the process of making a rectangular ashlar block, the block that has been damaged can no longer be used. However, if the same mistake occurs in the creation of a polygonal block, it simply means a complementary face has to be created for the adjacent stone.
This trial and error approach, where blocks are continuously shaped and checked until the fit is perfect and then filling in gaps with wedge stones, makes a lot of sense. It has the benefit of relying on technology and methods that were readily available to the Inca. There's actually another line of evidence that shows that these blocks were regularly moved to check fittings, and those are bosses, these protuberances near the bottom of blocks. These appear to have been used as a point of leverage, where a beam or possibly even a rope in some cases could have been used to lift the block from its foundation to allow masons to remove excess material and improve the fit. In fact, many bosses show damage on their undersides from repeated use. Gouges and recesses are also sometimes cut into blocks for this same purpose, and you can see examples of this at Sacsayhuaman. When construction was completed, these bosses would have been removed by masons to give the stone a smooth finish. And with all that, we have finished our Canina Cupirca, looking marvelous. We did it, guys. High fives and caros of chicha beer for everyone. Huzzah! But wait, some of you in the audience may understandably be wondering, okay, sure, this method could work well enough with smaller and medium-sized stones, but what about larger blocks like those at Sacsayhuaman or the monoliths at Ollantaytambo? Could this method really be feasible for blocks so large? That is a fair question. Based on my research, there are two ways that scholars and researchers have approached this. You can appeal, as I have already, to the fact that the Inca had access to huge amounts of corvée labor. In this system, labor and time were of little consequence to the Inca elite, and later accounts record workforces in the thousands, sometimes tens of thousands. On the other hand, you can appeal to alternative approaches. Perhaps bigger blocks do require bigger solutions. After all, if you look at some of the blocks at Sacsayhuaman, they are massive. While those could have been fitted through grueling trial and error, could there have been another approach? Well, Mr. Vince Lee certainly thought so. Vince Lee was a very interesting researcher because he was not a professionally trained archaeologist or anthropologist. Dare I say, Mr. Lee's resume reads like a list of ways to be awesome, because he was a U.S. Marine, an architect, mountaineer, writer, world traveler, and amateur archaeologist. Over his career, he made very important contributions to the study of Inca architecture, particularly with Inca roofing techniques. However, in the 1980s, he put his mind to this problem, and in 1986, he proposed a very interesting alternative method: scribing and coping. No, this isn't the fine art of writing things down and dealing with the consequences. Rather, this is the art of shaping something to fit the contours of an edge or face. For any carpenters or woodworking enthusiasts out there, you've probably used this technique when you've created a coped joint for molding or trim. However, in this case, the scribing would have been done with stone. Lee proposed that large stones were raised above their resting place, and that the Inca would have used a measuring stick and plumb bob on a line to scribe the surface as a mason carved away excess material from the stone. The use of a plumb bob is important here. By running a string through the lower stick, a scriber can easily ensure that the tool stays consistently level during the scribing process. We know that the plumb bob was a tool used by the Inca because several have been recovered in archaeology, and there are Quechua words for a plumb bob listed in colonial dictionaries of Quechua made at contact. The appeal of this approach is that if scribed and worked correctly, the stone could be moved, worked, double checked, and then set down with a tight fit in one go, potentially saving a lot of time and effort and some blood, sweat, and tears. Pretty sweet. However, as rad as this idea sounds, it's not without its criticisms. Lee himself admits that the evidence for this is almost entirely circumstantial. We don't have any colonial accounts that attest to this method. JP also points out that Lee's theories do not account for the use of wedge stones and bosses in construction, and I haven't seen Lee address this in any of his works, unless I've missed something. In Lee's defense, he has actually tested this, and if you want to see it in action, you can watch that PBS Nova documentary that I mentioned earlier. And to his credit, the process worked. But I think it's safe to say that the results leave something to be desired. On the other hand, this was a first attempt, and Lee appeared quite confident that with more practice, he and his crew could get better and faster at this. I think that's a fair point. At the end of the day, I do think that this theory has some merit and that it is worth discussing. By the way, if you want more details about this theory from the man himself, Dr. David Miano from the channel World of Antiquity has a wonderful interview with Vince Lee about his theory that I highly recommend watching. While we're on the topic of alternative theories, I do want to take some time to discuss other theories around Inca Masonry so that I don't have to copy and paste the same reply to a bunch of comments telling me that I'm dumb and I don't know what I'm talking about. First off, let's discuss the idea that the Inca used acid to melt or soften up blocks to get that fine fit. Now, I'm not opposed to this idea outright, but I'll explain why I'm not sold on it yet. It's well known that acid can soften up or dissolve materials like limestone really well, although doing so in a manner that is so controlled that it results in a nice tight bond makes me skeptical. It strikes me as something that would get real messy, real fast, and take a long time. The best iteration of this theory comes from Dr. Helmut Trebuch, a German naturalist, scientist, and physicist. Trebuch argues that the red clay we mentioned earlier that the Inca used for fitting was actually an acidic clay that was used to dissolve stone faces to get that fit. To back this up, Trebuch relies heavily on two passages from Cieza de Leon and Garcilaso de la Vega. To quote from Cieza de Leon,
It is said to be certain that in these buildings of Ollantaytambo For others which had that name, molten gold was found instead of mortar in a certain area of the royal palace or the Sun Temple, with which, together with the bitumen which they apply, the stones remain fitted to each other.
And to quote from Garcilaso de la Vega,
In many of the royal palaces and temples of the sun, they poured in molten lead and silver and gold for mortar. Pedro de Cieza also reports this, and I am glad to adduce the evidence of Spanish historians in support of what I know.
Trebuch argues from these accounts that the Yanka clay, bitumen, gold, and silver are all descriptions of one mortar used by the Incas, a mortar that happened to be acidic. According to his paper, the acidic mortar would have been applied as the stones were set. Eventually, it would disappear over time, leaving the bonded masonry. He proposes that the acidic mortar was made with pyrite and that it would have softened the stones and allowed them to bond. I'm no chemist, so I'm not going to comment on the chemistry presented by Trebuch. His paper is peer reviewed, so I'm assuming that this has been checked by other experts, so I've got no issue with that. My big issue, however, is with his interpretation of the text. First, this clashes with several colonial accounts stating that no mortar was used, and that the clay was used as a time saving technique so that only the faces of the rocks had to be joined. As we saw earlier, examples of this clay have been found in Inca masonry, and Trebuch doesn't cite any studies on this clay to confirm its acidic properties. Second, mortar isn't something you typically pour. Rather, it's something that is spread over and around bricks and stone. What I believe Cieza de Leon is referring to in the text are metal clamps that were used to hold certain blocks together, many examples of which have been found in Inca architecture. Fans of this theory have pointed to limestone at Sacsayhuaman that looks like it may have been dissolved by some sort of acidic substance, but limestone is particularly vulnerable to sulfur pollution from modern industry, and many of these appear to be calcite deposits deposited by mineral rich water that have eroded over time. What's more is that while the Inca used limestone, they also used many other types of stone like rhyolite, andesite, and granite, which probably wouldn't react to acid in the same way. This method is certainly in the realm of possibility, but given the evidence, I don't think it's probable that the Inca employed this. But I could very well be wrong. Now, if somebody out there has done any experiments with this method and gotten multiple stones to fit tightly together, I would love to know. I could only find examples of people using acid to dissolve limestone, but none that attempted to use this to fit stone blocks. If someone can make this work with Inca technology, I'm all for it. Second, there are theories that these stones aren't actually stones, but geopolymers or some other material that was made in a mold and then finally fitted together. I want to be generous here, but I have a lot of problems with these theories. First off, as we've already seen, Inca quarries are well documented. We can be certain that the Inca were quarrying and transporting large stones to many different construction sites. If they were building with geopolymers, why would they bother moving large stone blocks to work sites? Second, studies on the petrography of Inca stones have shown that they are definitely stones. For example, a study done in 2021 on stones from the Coricancha showed that they were biotite andesites belonging to the late Pleistocene Rumicolca formation. Third, if the Inca were using molds to make blocks, we should expect to see standard sizes and shapes with Inca blocks. And, well, that's just not what we see. In polygonal masonry, each block is uniquely shaped, and that would mean that each block required its own mold. Even in ashlar masonry, the blocks lack standard dimensions, so even these would have required individual molds. This isn't looking like a great time saving technique. And speaking of molds, we know that the Inca didn't use molds in the manufacture of their construction materials. We know this because the Inca built extensively with adobe bricks, and people like JP and John Rao have observed that adobe bricks in buildings vary greatly in size and have rounded corners and edges, which indicates that these were made by hand and not made in a brick mold. If the Inca had molds that they could pour some sort of geopolymer or mixture into, why weren't they using them with adobe bricks? It's a simple device that would have saved them a lot of time and effort in their planning and construction. As neat as this theory sounds, it just doesn't match the evidence that we have. A third popular theory is the age old appeal to aliens or lost advanced civilizations. I doubt I'll surprise many by saying that I don't really like these theories, so I'll keep this short. Archaeology has given us a very good understanding of Inca chronology at Inca sites. Archaeological work has shown that Inca masonry consistently dates to the time of the Inca. There's no evidence to my knowledge of Inca construction that dates back thousands of years into the past. Now, if you want to attribute this construction to aliens in the 15th century and claim that Inca accounts just don't mention this or that there's a cover up, you're basically asking your audience to take a leap of faith, because this is an unfalsifiable hypothesis that can't be proven or disproven. If you want to believe this in your heart of hearts, you are welcome to. But just know that scientists and scholars probably won't take the position seriously because there's no way to prove or disprove it. On that note, let's wrap things up. Inca style construction is often said to end abruptly with the Spanish conquest, but if you've been paying attention, you can probably see why that idea is problematic. Many colonial writers witnessed the Inca working in stone because indigenous architecture continued for decades after the conquest as it transitioned into a colonial style. Examples of this can be seen at the site of Chinchero. This site was originally the private estate of Topa Inca Yupanqui, but after the conquest, it was turned into a colonial town. What's interesting is that the earliest colonial construction in the town has Inca elements, such as wall niches, which shows that even though the Spanish authorities were dictating what was built, the locals could still employ their own Incan idioms in the architecture. Perhaps the best example can be seen at the Casa de las Sierpes in Cusco. The building was commissioned by Don Pedro Bernardo de Quiroz as his personal residence, and it reused Inca ashlar blocks. But Bernardo de Quiroz also commissioned that lintel with those creatures carved in relief, which you can see was flawlessly fit to the rest of the stones. This speaks to the fact that Inca masonry survived into the colonial period, and that Inca masons could still achieve fine fits. Also, if you ever visit Cusco, this building is now a hotel, so you can stay there and tell people, with some exaggeration, that you stayed in a building that the Inca built. This building also shows us how a lot of fine ashlar masonry got reused in other colonial buildings. If we return to Chinchero for a moment, the church was constructed with many reused Inca blocks. Note that the corners still retain the original Inca construction, while the rest is made of reused Inca ashlars that were mortared together. Other places like Sacsayhuaman were turned into quarries, which is why you'll see blocks missing from the walls, some of which have been rather crudely filled in modern times. Despite all that, there's so much surviving Inca masonry for us to admire, and it speaks to the amazing durability of their work and construction. Inca masonry is something that we can understand on the Inca's own terms, with their own technology. That's not to say that their fine masonry was easy or simple. It was demanding and laborious, but the Inca elite clearly considered these results to be worth the effort. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Inca had a deep relationship with stone. Stones and rocks around them could embody powerful beings and forces. In some stories, these stones even came alive and lived and breathed. They also drew upon a deep and long tradition of fine masonry that stretched back thousands of years. Inca masonry wasn't a new idea, so much as a new take on an idea that was very old. From archaeology, colonial sources, and modern experiments, we have a good understanding of how Inca masonry worked. We don't need to appeal to fantastic solutions. The Inca Empire was huge. If it was around today, it would be the fifth largest country in the Western Hemisphere. As such, it commanded vast resources and could organize and muster large workforces to work on projects that hitherto could not have been imagined. Inca workers quarried stone, prepared it, transported it to work sites, cut and dressed the stone, and skillfully fit the blocks together. These guys were masters at their craft, and we should tip our hats at their achievement. If you ever get to visit Peru, you'll be taken aback by its incredible architecture, and I hope that this video can give you a better appreciation for the skill and work that it took to make it. And that's gonna wrap us up for today. Once again, special thanks to Tony for his inspiration, assistance, and allowing me to use his photos. Definitely check out his website linked below. Also, special thanks to my patrons listed here. You guys were very patient on this one, and you're the best. If you would like to join the ranks of these fine individuals and support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and follow us on Facebook. Take care, and we'll see you in our next episode.